Welcome back. So this week we are going to be working on making a poster that's about the information you're learning about the next steps in forming the government. So what you need for today's lesson is this article, which was emailed to your family earlier. I'm going to read through this, stop and discuss it a little bit, and then maybe we'll highlight some of the most important parts. So today is about learning the information and highlighting the most important parts of it. All right? So just follow along as I read. The Great Compromise and the 3/5 Clause. Remember the types of government we talked about last time? The colonists decided that a representative democracy was their best bet. They would elect representatives, and those representatives would make laws that were in their best interests. So remember the common good? So it was the job of those representatives to make laws that were for the common good. They made a document called the Articles of Confederation, and that was the big governing document at the time. And mostly what it talked about was having a representative democracy. But it wasn't a super specific and super strong document. It didn't talk, there were a whole lot of issues that come up in the running of a country that it didn't cover. So pretty soon they started to have problems and realize that they didn't have laws in place for a lot of really important issues. So the leaders in the new United States had to strike a careful balance. They did not want to give the government too much power. After all, they had gone to war to break free from that. But they also needed the government to be strong enough to make laws, enforce laws, build an army, negotiate with other countries, collect taxes to keep things running, and keep the states from fighting with each other over trade and taxes. So it's important to understand how different the colonies were from each other. In a lot of ways, they were almost like separate countries, even though really, officially, they were part of the same country. They lived in very different climates. They had very different religions and customs, and their economies, which means how they made their money, was also very different in each region. Remember, those regions were New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. For example, in New England, there were only very small farms. They had a lot of fishing and small farms and a lot of forests, which they used for lumber, which they could sell. So that's one kind of life. The middle colonies they had some fishing, they had some larger farms. They were kind of a real mix. They had lots of different industries there. And then in the South, they had all this land that was perfect for growing really lucrative crops like tobacco and indigo and rice, things like that. So they'd have these really big farms, which they sometimes called plantations. And farming and selling those crops was the main source of their economy. So very, very different. They were all settled for different reasons, and they had, some ideas about each other that weren't always really positive. So it wasn't automatic that they wanted to work together. Let's get back to the text. So in 1787, they held another convention to create a stronger government. They decided on a federal system, which meant individual states would share power with national or a federal government. So each state, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Virginia, each of those states had a state government where they made laws about things that directly affected that state. They made their laws about education and taxes and things like that. And that's the state government. And then the federal government, also called the national government, made laws about things that affected the entire country, all of those states together, like negotiating with other countries, raising an army, things like that. And so there's two parts to the government now. Let's see. States would make laws about their schools, elections, businesses, and then the federal government would make laws about things that affected the whole country. It wasn't easy for all the representatives to agree on this plan. One of the biggest arguments was about how the states would be represented. Many of the larger states wanted the number of representatives to be based on the number of people who lived in that state. For example, if you lived in a really big state like Virginia, you would have a lot of representatives. If you lived in a very small state like Rhode Island, you would have far fewer representatives. So big states loved that. Guess what the little states thought of that? Yeah, not so much, right? They wanted to have as much representation as the big states. So that was a major sticking point. Let's see. Okay, so then the small states felt that was unfair because they wouldn't have as much representation. They wanted every state to have the same number of representatives, no matter how many people lived there. Just to make it really easy to imagine, let's say that Virginia had 100,000 people. Even at that time, they had more than that. But let's say they had 100,000 people. And the rule was you get one representative for every 10,000 people. That means Virginia would have 10 representatives. Then you've got Rhode Island. Let's say Rhode Island has only 10,000 people. Guess how many representatives they would get? One. So Rhode Island is not happy about this. All the small states are not happy about this. They said, same number of representatives, no matter what. Every state gets the same number. So here's what they decided. They decided there would be two sections of what they called Congress. Congress is the body of people who make the laws. And within Congress, there's two sections. There's the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the number of representatives each state got in the House was based on how many people they had living in their state. The more people, the more representatives. The Senate, each state had 2 representatives, no matter the size of their population. So they kind of did both. They gave the states, the smaller states, some of what they wanted, and they gave the larger states some of what they wanted. And they called that the Great Compromise. All right? So there was another issue that the states didn't agree on. The country still had a massive number of enslaved people. Slavery is still huge in the United States at this time. Most, but not all, lived in the southern states, working on large farms and plantations. That was because they had these really large farms and plantations. It takes a lot of human work to raise those kind of crops, to pick those kind of crops, to keep a plantation running. If you have a very small farm or just, a shop in the village, or you're on a fishing boat, or you're whaling, those kinds of ways of making money don't require as many people. So the New England states didn't need a whole lot of enslaved people. And the middle colonies, they had some larger farms, but still not as much. And that's really why there are so many enslaved people in the southern states and fewer in the northern states. So let's get back to this. Most, but not all, lived in the southern states working on large farms and plantations. There were slaves in the north, but far fewer. The northern states did make a lot of money on the slave trade, though. They were not all innocent and not all against slavery. It just wasn't as necessary where they lived. But some people in New England ran those ships that went to Africa and picked up enslaved people, brought them back, and sold them. So it's not like they weren't engaging in the slave trade. Okay. The next issue around slavery was, would enslaved people... I skipped something. So their main source of income was crops like rice, indigo, and tobacco. They fought hard to keep slavery legal. Some of the southern states even threatened to leave the Union, the country of the United States, if slavery was not allowed. They said, well, we're just not going to be part of the country then. So they made another compromise, and they allowed slavery to continue. The next issue around slavery was, would enslaved people count towards the population and therefore the number of representatives in the House of Representatives? So remember, the House is, number of representatives is based on how many people you have living there. So do the enslaved people count as part of that population or not? They didn't have any rights, but should they count? Guess what? The southern states, yeah, they should count. There are people living in our state, so they should count towards our representation in the House. And the New England states, the middle colonies, not so much. That's not fair. They're not citizens. They shouldn't count. That's just making your population larger and you're getting more representation, and that's not fair. So another compromise. This time they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Your population of enslaved people, we will count 3/5 of them toward your total population. So every white person counts as one person. Then they took all this enslaved people and took 3/5 of that number and counted that towards the population. So that's called the 3/5 clause. It was another compromise. And then finally, they had to decide about enslaved people who escaped to freedom. So remember, some enslaved people were able to escape. It was very dangerous and very difficult, and most didn't make it, but some did. So they said, oh, are they free now? And what they decided was that if they were caught, they would have to be returned to their plantation and to slavery. So they would not be free if they were caught. We had a long way to go before we were a truly free country. Okay, so that gives you something to think about. And let's just take a look now. If you have a pencil or a pen or a highlighter, let's go through what we read and maybe underline or highlight some of the important parts. It's all kind of important, but so let's see, the types of government we talked about last time. That's we kind of already covered that in the work that we did last week, so we don't need to put that on the poster. Okay, government too much power after they had gone to war to break free from all that, but they also needed the government to be strong enough to make laws. So then we talked about how it's important to understand how different the colonies were. What I really want us to put on our poster is what starts here. In 1787, let's definitely include the date, they held another convention to create a stronger government. They decided on a federal system. And let's highlight or underline what a federal system meant. It meant that individual states would share power with the national or federal government. This whole business here, that's going to end up on our poster, okay? Now we talk about how it wasn't easy. One of the biggest arguments was about how the states would be represented. So what I really want to include on our poster is what they decided. So let's skip down to here. There would be two sections of Congress, a House of Representatives and the Senate. And then let's include what that meant. So I'm going to include the stuff that explains what happens in the House of Representatives and what happens with the Senate. Okay? Let's see. Now, the other information we're going to include on this poster are the 3 laws that were decided on about slavery. So let's scan that part. There was another issue the states didn't agree on, a massive number of enslaved people. Okay. All right. So we learned that the southern states threatened to leave the Union if they made slavery illegal. So they made another compromise and allowed slavery to continue. Now, what's the next thing they did here? Would enslaved people count towards the population, therefore the number of representatives in the House of Representatives? Okay, so here's the compromise. They compromised and said that each enslaved person would, that's actually not true. It's that 3/5, this is an old one, yours says the right thing. 3/5 of the slaves would count as part of the population. And then, finally, they had to decide about enslaved people who escaped to freedom. Were they free or not? Congress decided that if they were caught, they had to be returned to the plantation and slavery. Okay, so those are the main pieces of information that we're going to include on the poster. I started sketching mine out a little bit so you kind of get an idea what it's going to look like. I did it kind of faintly because I'm just starting, but we're going to, I titled it Next Steps Toward a New Government, because that's what it is. And then we're going to explain how Congress worked. We're going to explain what a federal republic means. And then we're going to include the 3 new laws about slavery. And we will start working on that tomorrow. All right. Bye, guys. I will see you next time.